Thank you very much for the the introduction. That's great. Can you hear me and see me all right? And can you see my slides? Awesome. Thanks for all the reactions. I got to say that uh, talking to agrologists, my favorite group of people. I'm very, very glad to be invited to speak to you today. I'm from University of Calgary and based, of course, in Alberta, and I run the Agriculture, Biodiversity, and Conservation Lab. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is our work through the Prairie Precision Sustainability Network. That's called the PPSN. I'm also going to talk about my own lab's work as well and how those two pieces come together. So let's get going. So when I look out there across the prairies, and this is a picture from Saskatchewan, I see a productive working landscape. There's lots of stuff going on. Well, apart from the highway, we've got various crops growing on here on this map, and we've also got all sorts of other things happening over here. Trees, looks like there might even be a golf course in this picture. Now, a farmer is reducing risk and increasing yields and profit. I'm sure you are aware of this, and benefiting from new genetics and mechanized, computerized, and scaled for productivity. But the question is, without scale, could we feed the world? Scale is pretty important. Every acre counts. Look at them. Make sure every acre needs to be harvested. But perhaps some acres might count more without crops. And that's where my story begins. And my question to you today is, what if we stopped seeding unprofitable acres? And the whole story can be summed up in my title, I hope. Unprofitable acres, win-wins for profitability and sustainability in Prairie Canada. And just a quick acknowledgement to all those who make this work possible. This is the work of the Prairie Precision Sustainability Network and the ABC Lab. I'm at the University of Calgary. I have associates at the University of Saskatchewan, some of whose work is represented here. And I've also been funded by Ducks Unlimited, Canola Council, Environment Climate Change Canada, Alberta Canola, SAS Canola, and also big thanks to NSERC Canada. So let's start with unprofitable acres. What do we mean? Well, there's the combine moving across the field, and as we all know, that if the farmer is equipped with a precision agricultural sensor, you might get a map something like the one on the right. And this map shows low yielding and high yielding areas. That's where the crop that crossed over the sensor in that equipment registered a high amount, and we can make a map of the field showing which parts were low or high yielding. And you can see along, looks like some kind of river or creek-like feature here in the middle, there might have been a lower blue-colored yield. In fact, if we add it up, about 10% of this field is low yielding. But our farmers still seeded this area. We know that they still seeded it because, well, we have precision agricultural data, precision yield data from that area. But why did they seed it if it was low yielding? Well, maybe it was a wet year, it was a dry year, it was a pest year, or maybe it's marginal and the farmer just always seeds it. It could be dry, there might be topography issues, drainage issues, it could be saline, big problem throughout Saskatchewan, a bit less so in the other provinces, but it's still there. And then it could just be wet, or it could be less organic content in the soil, all sorts of factors that might cause these acres to be low yielding. Well, you're losing money on those acres, so why are you seeding them again and again? If you take your yield and you multiply it by your commodity price, whatever it is, and you subtract your input costs, it comes down to a loss. Why are you doing that? This was just 1 year, Maybe it was just an unlucky year, or maybe it was year over year. What if this happens every year for every crop in the rotation on those particular acres? What should our farmer do? Well, one thing we could do is look at multiple years for that field, and I know that agronomists and agrologists are doing this. They are working with farmers to look at the sequence of precision, yield, and other data that comes from the field, soil data as well, to understand what's happening year over year. Our goal in our network, and we'll talk about that more, is to do this in a coordinated way across multiple years and across big chunks of the country. So let's look at this, the same field, 2014, 15, 16, 17, and so far on up to 2022, different crops, different years, different yield maps. But it just seems that year over year, the valley of this creek and the immediate proximity seems to be low yielding. Well, if we could crunch all that data together, make a simple model of this field, it might look like something we have at the bottom here. We could color that map with red for high loss, pink or orange for sort of medium, and black for, that's where the profit from the field is the highest. So what we've done here is we've taken the yield data and we've applied, as I said, that expenses and that crop price to produce a map, and we've colored it to show which parts of the field are high, low, or loss. But what's happening down here, farmer, seems over the last, 7, 8, 9 years, regardless of the crop, you've been losing money. Why are you seeding it? Well, our goal is to look at this not just on one farmer's field, but across big chunks of the Canadian prairies. And as you know, there is the Canadian prairies. The yellow bits are the fields. And if you add up the area of all of those fields across the prairies, not just in Saskatchewan, but of course in Alberta and Manitoba, and even this little bit up here in Grand Prairie that everyone seems to forget about. If you add that all together, you get 80% of Saskatchewan. So imagine you take all that yellow bit and you stack it all on top of each other. That's like having 80% of Saskatchewan just covered in canola. It's a big area. If I wasn't talking to Saskatchewan, I might say it was like covering the entirety of France in just canola. It's a big area. Our goal here is to actually try and estimate marginality, low profitability across most of that area. And we do that. In fact, when I say we, I'm part of a team, but it's really led by Steve Shirtliff at the University of Saskatchewan. We take all of that data and we combine it with Sentinel-2, that's the satellite we see here, and we put it into this big black box, machine learning AI. We crunch it all together, and we can make maps of that area. So where do we start? We start with a lot of precision yield data, and we have a team working with the Prairie Precision Sustainability Network that I'm talking about mostly at the moment. And they've been working with growers, producers all across the prairies. And over the last couple of years, they have accumulated almost 1 million acres of precision yield data. And some of that is over as much as 10 or 12 years from 75 farmers in 2,700 fields across the prairies. And you can see where we're getting this data. And we need more of this precision yield data because we're using it to train our models, to combine it with satellite data to tell this story. So using satellite imagery plus this data on the ground, plus a little bit of black box AI, we can make maps to try and understand where the low profitability areas are in the prairies. And here's some products that are coming out of this story. Again, this is, although all of us in the network are helping here, this is the main products of Steve Shirtliff's lab, University of Saskatchewan. And you can see that we are starting to make maps that describe low profitability, low yielding areas using this technique. So how many unprofitable acres are there out there in the Canadian prairies? Well, that's a really interesting question to us, and nobody really knows. It's been estimated it could be as much as 10% of the entire region is unprofitable. In other words, farmers seeding it year over year, but not getting anything back for it. We don't know that for sure, and that number is based on things like, salinity acres and other, soil properties. But we're trying to estimate it now based on profitability. And what does 10% look like? Well, this little blue area is just 6% of this quarter section like thing. So just looking at it, we're talking visually about quite a lot of area. So, agronomists have seen these pictures before and just want to draw it to your attention. This is data off of a canola field for 1 year, 2022 on the left here. And along the bottom axis here, we have the profit, the dollars per acre, 0 all the way up to, some very high values. And then also the number of acres that achieve that value. And if you look below, the left end here, these are the acres where the farmer is losing money in that particular year. And you can see that on all of these fields, whether it was in canola or lentils or spring wheat, there is some amount of loss happening. When you look at it from this profit distribution, the number of acres that make that profit. So there's your marginal areas. We could also map that in the same way. We can make a map. This is a canola field in southwest Saskatchewan, and we've now recolored that distribution, same kind of graph, profit, dollars per acre along here, and the number of acres that make that profit. And we've colored everything that has a loss with a 0%. So that's the red area. And you can see that we can actually see that this is clustered in certain parts of the field. So you could say, hey, farmer, it might not be that hard to just sort of square off this part of the field and maybe not farm it. And we've developed a tool. My lab has developed a tool as part of the Prairie Precision Sustainability Network to kind of help farmers identify these parts of the field. So we work with farmers. They give us their multi-year precision yield data, and then we run a simple model with it, and we put it through this tool, and then they can just open it up online, and they can say, well, in the future, I think the crop price for spring wheat is going to be $8 a bushel, or maybe I think it's 10, or maybe I think it's 12, and they're going to drag a slider here, and they'll think, well, I anticipate my future expenses for growing spring wheat on this field is going to be about, this many dollars per acre. And it will make a picture like this, where, the more purple it is, the more likely we predict it's going to be unprofitable in future. And we work with farmers to do stuff with what they see in this picture. So again, same story. You look at the input costs per acre and the predicted revenues. What would you make off these acres in the future? So looking ahead, looking at how productive it was in the past, what do we think you'll get in the future if you make some assumptions about what the market will look like or what your expenses will be? So here's some examples of these maps for real Alberta fields. Somewhere in Alberta, you can see that we've got this field year over year. There's a low profitability spot somewhere here that gets seeded. Along the edge of this field, it looks like there's a pasture nearby. You're seeing along the edge here, reliably unprofitable or low profit. And then this field again, along the edges, you can see areas here that might be squared off. Let's look at Saskatchewan now. Some growers in Saskatchewan looking at their data, similar patterns, a lot of salinity in this middle field. Again, surrounding salinity or wetlands or areas that are in dry or wet years are not performing well. And then along the river in this image. And then Manitoba, same story, slightly different marginality concerns in Alberta and in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, but similar patterns across these areas. Okay, so I know you're thinking, agrologist, agronomist, many of you are also farmers, and then also trying to think like your clients and your farmers. So I can save a few dollars on a few acres. So what? Well, the next middle part of my talk here is to try and make the case that, it's not just about the dollars, although there's definitely also about the dollars. It's not just about the dollars. You can also get some other things as well. And we're going to talk about now work from just my lab at the University of Calgary, the ABC lab, in terms of beneficial insects, higher yields when you take some of these acres out of production, and ecosystem services. And I know that many agrologists are interested in these sustainable agriculture concepts. So let's start there. But then my field would get messy. If I converted parts of my field that were low profitability into, let's say, a forage, or, maybe I planted some shrubs there. That's kind of expensive. But, forage is more likely, it would get messy and I'd have to drive around it. And, this farmer is clearly driving around in circles, and that costs more fuel, and it's a busy day and I have a lot to do. Do I have time to do this? These are all real concerns, and they're definitely part of the equation, and we do think about them. But I'm going to make a case that despite those things, messy fields, just like this one, messy fields might matter. And I'm going to open up the book here on what I call, and I've been calling for a few years now, messy fields research. Let's make our fields messier. And what do I mean by messy fields? Okay, what do I mean? Well, let's just look at it from a contrasting perspective. On the left, these are very tidy fields. You can see each of these is a quarter section somewhere in southern Alberta, and you can see this was just when canola was in bloom. And there's almost nothing going on in this landscape except, well, quarter sections from field edge to field edge. Let's look at this one on the right, though. This is also the same scale, the same number of quarter sections. This is in the black soil in north or sort of central Alberta, could easily be in northeastern or northwestern Saskatchewan as well. These are much more complex landscapes. What do I mean by messy fields? Well, I mean about something maybe in the middle. A lot more stuff going on in that landscape that isn't just crop. I mean, perenniality, that kind of stuff brings benefits. And if we can bring some of those benefits to the table, perhaps by converting marginal areas, maybe we can get a whole suite of other things. So let's start by talking about beneficial insects as one of the things we might get from messy fields, from messy landscapes. Beneficial insects is one of the major focuses of the ABC lab. It's not the only one, but it's the one I'm going to start with. So back in 2015, Canola Council, Saskanola, Alberta Canola, Manitoba Canola growers funded my lab to really look at beneficial insects, to establish what they called a surveillance network for beneficial insects. And we set out across chunks of Alberta in this case to look at bees and beetles across a big area. And we visited about 350 fields, as you can see the red dots, across the province. And we found 300 species of bee, bumblebees. Of course, we found honeybees. We found ground beetles and spiders and harvestmen. And this is what our operation looks like. And I always like to stop for just 1 minute, to add a hey wow factor. Did you know that not only do we have furry, beautiful bumblebees like this one, we have green bees in the prairies, we have blue bees in the prairies, and we have orange bees in the prairies, and we also have many other types as well. Anyway, beneficial insects like bees and beetles, they can help crops. Let's just unpack that now. What do we mean by beneficials? Well, we can mean things like natural enemies, beetles like this big one, Pterosticus melanarius, a very common beetle in all of our fields. And then other types of beetles like these ones eating larvae of crop pests, and also other beetles that eat that are granivores, that eat the seeds of weeds as well. What about pollinators as well? Things like flies, like the syrphid fly, this hoverfly, potentially a somewhat important pollinator for canola crops, perhaps for alfalfa as well. And then you also have bees like these. So beneficial insects, what are we talking about? A bit of science now. Let's turn the page and try and ask some scientific questions about how would we show to agrologists, to agronomists, to farmers, to decision makers, to anyone really, that mess matters. So here's a little model for you, like, of how we try and do that in our lab. You can imagine we've got a messy place here, whatever it is. It's a former wetland or a perennial area or a low spot or a high spot, whatever it is. And let's set out some sampling stations. And over on the map, the graph on the right here, it shows you along this bottom axis, the x-axis, distance from that messy place, closer versus farther away. And over this y-axis, the up and down, the more or less insects. So let's just put a spot on this map here. Let's put a sampling station there, that plus sign. Let's put the same sampling station on the graph. And our expectation is if we're going to sample close to that messy place, there's close, we would find more insects. Now let's sample at a few more locations that are, across the field, that are further away from that messy place. And we might get a relationship like this. We might expect to see that the number of insects that we sample, they might be bees or they might be beetles, they would get fewer the further we go away. That would tell us that a messy place like this is having an effect. If you like, we call that the spillover effect. You can imagine a boiling pot, and if its boiling pot is filled with water, it's going to bubble up and water is going to spill over the sides. And when you're closer to the pot, there's going to be more soup on your stove than when you're further away. The same idea. If these messy places are homes or habitats or somehow important for beneficial insects, there's going to be more of them when you're closer to that place. So this is what we call the spillover effect. And it's one way we have of saying these features, messy things in our fields, might actually be the source of beneficial insects. So let's test that. And let's show you first that we are evidence from our lab that messy fields might be better for natural enemies. And we did that study again from looking at beetles, in particular, looking if there was evidence for a spillover effect. And in a few different studies from my lab, we found just that indeed beetles of all sorts, both the granivores, the ones that eat the weed seeds, as well as ones that eat the crop pests, are associated with these patches, and particularly the smallest ones, the ones that might eat the eggs of our pests, are very reliant on being close to these messy places. So they move out from this, let's call it the habitat in the messy place here, and they spill over into the crop where they eat food for them, which is the eggs or the larvae here that are our crop pests, or in some cases the weed seeds, and then they move back. And indeed, another study, we found that it depends on the time of the year. They're moving back and forth from the messy place into the field. And we found that across about 330 sites in Alberta. We also found something else interesting. Again, all of this work, I should mention, is done not by me, but done by students and other trainees working in the ABC lab. This work in particular was led by Tobin Neem, Sam Robinson, and what they have shown, another thing that Tobin in particular showed, and doing this really very interesting approach, which Tobin came up with, was let's put these plasticine caterpillars in the field. Plasticine caterpillars, come on. Little bits of green plasticine rolled only about 3 centimeters long, and we'll stick them in the fields right at ground level. And it turns out that you can actually detect which kind of animal tried to attack this as prey. And we tried some experiments where we put these caterpillars in a terrarium with some beetles and spiders and things, and we could see what kind of marks their mouth prints left in the plasticine. Anyway, so Tobin put all these out, plasticine caterpillars, and they also put egg carts. These are little eggs of they're not alive. They were killed, frozen eggs of moths, and put them out in the field here, and we counted how many were eaten later. So basically what we showed is that the natural enemies, whether they be beetles or they be spiders, bite more. They eat more bad guys, or at least they try to eat the bad guys in the case of the plasticine, when they are closer to those messy patches. So being close to the messy areas matters. Messy fields are better for bees. Now, when we talk about bees, we're not just talking about honeybees, of course. We're talking about those 300, 400 species of bees that live in the prairies. And why do farmers care about bees? Well, that's a good question. And it's taken me 10 years to really realize that, of course, well, farmers do care about biodiversity. They care about sustainability. Absolutely, they want to make sure their practice doesn't harm nature. Very much, I see that in farmers I talk to all the time. But in terms of how does it affect their yield, messy fields, bees, there might be bees that visit canola, and there's been a few studies that shown when we have bees or flies visiting canola, helping to pollinate, you get slightly higher yields. And it depends on many things like the variety and so forth. But we do know that, having pollinators near your crop is like an insurance policy for certain things, particularly related to canola and also for alfalfa. Anyway, we can find evidence that bees also spill over, and the same idea here. And here's actual data I'm showing you, simplified a bit. So distance from the messy edge and the number of bees, and these are 132 species we looked at, and the bees do it too. Yeah, so they spill over from the edge of the field, and you can see that effect that I described in our data earlier. We also found that, just looking at about 150 places just south of Calgary here, we also compared these locations. Some of these locations were messier. So if you look inside this red circle, some were messier than others. And we looked at a gradient of messy places across this region, and we found that, you have more species, more biodiversity, if you like, when you've got more mess. So, and now here's a clincher that, took us a number of years to develop this work, but I think is really important because it brings it back to, it's not just about the biodiversity, it's not just about the beneficials eating the crop pests or eating the weed seeds or helping to pollinate. It's also about, does that actually matter? Is there pay dirt, for this work? And we do have evidence that messy fields support higher crop yields. So let's look at that evidence. So you'd think that if the mess matters, you might see an effect on crop yield. So looking at this sort of not very messy field on the left, around the edge of that field, there might be, a crop margin that's grassy along the road allowance for whatever, and that's kind of like a little skinny bit of habitat. And if that's having an effect on the field, you might see this sort of higher crop yield around the edge that's shown in red. It might have, if there's any effect that's positive of that area on the crop, it might show up as what we call a halo in the crop yield. And look at this much messier field on the right. You've got wetlands and other stuff here and more grassy areas and habitat and homes for beneficial insects and other good aspects of nature, if you like, that are positive for the field. You might see a halo that sort of encompasses a great deal of the field. And when I show a map like this to farmers, they often say, well, there's no crop in the picture on the right. And, absolutely, I hear that. But this is mostly for emphasis, to give you the idea that, a halo, the distribution of that messy stuff in the field can actually affect which parts of the crop see an effect. So how do we do a study like this? Well, here's what we do. We do, like we described earlier, the work that I described as part of the PPSN. Well, we started that process back in about 2019 in a much sort of simpler and less ambitious way. What we tried to do was combine satellite data, again, from this Sentinel platform with yield data that we got from about a much smaller number of farmers, mostly in central and eastern Alberta near Vermilion. So we got data from 757 canola fields. That's quite a large number. And how did we get data from that many fields? Well, and I always pause here to sound really serious, we spied on those fields from space. Farmers don't like to know that we're spying on them, but it's not just us that are spying on them. Indeed, it's the entire industry that's spying on everybody's fields from space. And what they do is, of course, we use satellite platforms like this, and we build models to kind of estimate what their yield was across these fields. Now, we weren't interested on spying on them to kind of, build a case about what they were doing, but rather just to understand what was going on in their fields in terms of yield. And so when we looked at those 757 data, particularly in a paper by a postdoctoral associate in my lab, Lan Nguyen, we found this pattern here where, here's our distance from our messy place, 0 to 250 meters. And here is our canola yield. Now, we don't have numbers here because the yield is sort of relative to the field average. But you can see that as you are close to the field edge, that yield is low. And then as you reach a short distance into the field, it's above average. And then it drops down to the average level for the field as you go further out into the field from a messy place. And what that picture looks is a bit like the one here on the right, that yellow patch. As you move away from that messy place, you get this yield halo, and then it kind of disappears to the normal level. Why do you get this low yield right at the field edge? Well, farmers know that, right? At the edge of the field, your crops aren't doing so well. They're exposed. There's more weed interference. And you can just see that some of the plants look much less, well yielding, certainly in many fields, not in all. And that's why we see this dip here right at the field edge. But what's interesting to us is this halo, which indicates that there's something special about these messy places that's happening, and it's distance limited. It's only happening a certain distance from these messy places. And well, it could be about bees, could be about beetles. It's also very probably also about moisture or better, richer soil that's somehow being affected by these messy places. Many factors could be at play. But another thing to say is this is not a big effect. It's quite a small one. It's not going to make farmers rich. But why we care about it is for two reasons. First of all, it pays for this edge effect. So the boost you're getting in this little distance out compensates for the loss you're getting at the edge of the field. But more interestingly, it also says that there's something special, and it's positive, not negative, something special about that messy place. So basically tells us if we add more messy places, well, we might get more edge effect, but we're not going to be losing out overall, and we might actually be getting something positive. As I say, it ain't going to make farmers rich, but we found halo effects like this in canola, in wheat, in barley, in pea, and oats. And in 3 different papers here, first one using yield measured from space. That's the one I just showed you a picture of, published in 2022. We also did it with just combine yield data alone. We found similar patterns, and we've isolated which particular features are more likely to see this effect, like wetlands versus field edges, and which crops. And then there's also a paper in 2020 where we looked at just at crop insurance data on a much kind of coarser scale. And we found that messier regions of Alberta are more likely to have higher crop yields, controlling for all sorts of other factors like moisture and so forth. So we have halos around the mess, but don't get too excited. It's not going to make anyone rich, but it gets me excited because it says that these areas have a positive effect on crops. And then if we add more of them, it's not likely to drain the yield extensively. Of course, we know when we have less crop overall, we're going to have less yield overall, but it's not going to have a disproportionate effect. One more thing, I often get the question, you see these, it's probably a lot about moisture or shelter belts or better soil. And yes, it is probably about all those things. And yes, we are starting to assess those things and tease them apart. But it's also a little bit about beneficial insects. And we put up these exclusion cages at various distances from messy places, just like in this picture, different red dots from that messy place. And these exclusion cages kept out bees. And in particular, they also probably kept out beetles as well. And we compared in the green and the gray here at different distances, the canola yield outside, that's the green, and inside the cages. And, at most distances from the messy place, there's no real difference between inside and outside. So in other words, the cages were having no effect on the crop. But in those places, just in this halo region, we found that outside, where the insects, the pollinators, could get at the crop, there was a significantly higher yield. So what that tells us is, in that sweet spot, in that yield halo, where the bees and the pollinators can access the crop, they can have an effect. They're not having an effect on the whole crop. They're having it mostly in that sweet spot, in that yield region. And it's not a big effect. All right, back to where we started. What if we stopped seeding unprofitable acres? What if? Then we could use these to make more mess. And you know what? I just love mess. I don't love it when my teenagers create mess in the house, but I like mess in fields and a limited amount. We have a way to make more mess, one field at a time, while saving, and this is the big bit, while saving farmers money. And back to the tool I described, this precision sustainability tool that we call it, this field analysis tool that we're now working with 100 or so growers across the prairies to identify parts of their fields using this tool. And we can draw these sliders to say, what do I think the crop price will be in the future? I think for canola, I might get this much. I'm reading, looking through the goggles of the future. And I think I can get my expenses down to about this much. If I do that, looking at the history of my field, I might see that these areas are just kind of predictably, regardless of the crop, something that might just not be worth seeding. Or maybe this area over here might just not be worth seeding. And well, maybe I should turn that into forage. Maybe the time has come where I just, make use of various programs like the Prairie Precision Sustainability Network, or the Marginal Areas program with Ducks Unlimited, or the MARS program in Saskatchewan. Maybe I'm going to work with one of these programs to convert this, and they're going to provide different amounts of funding to support me to make this transition. And I'll plant it in forages so it doesn't get all weedy. And I'll follow best practices to get that established. And then I'm not going to worry about this area anymore. I'm going to stop losing money on these acres. I'm going to stop spending money on inputs. I'm going to stop spending money on seed. I'm going to stop spending money on fuel to drive over it a few times a year. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to let that be. And I'm also going to create habitat. I'm going to create a messy place, perennial grasses that are going to have a positive effect on the surrounding crop. It's going to be a home to beneficial insects and potentially is going to have a yield halo on the rest of the crop. So as I say, we have a way to make more mess from your unprofitable acres. And when I say we, yes, it's part of this Prairie Precision Sustainability Network I've been talking about, but there's two key people, and I'm not sure if both of them are on this call right now, but Andrea Asselford and Tamara McLaughlin, both key people here, and they work day to day, every day, talking to agronomists, talking to farmers, building relationships, and through what we call the snowball method, where they talk to one farmer who gives them the phone number of another farmer, we have built together a really impressive network of farmers working together to try and look at what might happen when farmers choose to convert parts of their fields, to kind of turn that into forages. And here are the people in the Prairie PSN, the leaders of that, and Christy Morrissey, University of Saskatchewan, is leading the current phase 2 of the Prairie Precision Sustainability Network. That's me in the field one sunny day. I led the first phase, and now I'm co-PI on the second phase. And the rest of us here, Steve Shortleff, Melissa Arcand, and others here are principal investigators representing University of Calgary, University of Saskatchewan, and several others. Universities. So we're growing, and we're looking for farmers, particularly farmers that would be willing to say, okay, I've got part of my field that isn't doing so well. I'm ready to make this change to forage, and we'll support them. We'll pay for costs per acre, and we'll pay for seed to help you make that change, particularly in those parts where you're already losing money. So with that, I just want to say that the ABC lab, the beneficial insects, and the yield halo part of this talk is resting very much on the shoulders of giants at the Agricultural Biodiversity and Conservation Lab, my students and trainees over the years doing all sorts of fun stuff in the fields. And if you have any questions, a lot of what I talked about is based on science, right? Nowadays, we got to say everything is based on science. It's not based on, me just thinking about things and telling you what I think. There are studies to back this up. And if you want me to show you the data, you can just send me an email, and I'd be happy to send you any of the publications related to this work. So with that, I'm just going to stop. And I don't know where I am on time, but I think I've probably done my at least my 45 minutes. So hopefully there's time for questions. So thank you for listening. Thank you very much for listening. Get in touch.
So Paul, Toby's going to do the Q&A session here. Toby, are you ready? I'm not sure. Maybe she has technical issues. So this is Annette here. I can do the Q&A session if she's not available. So the question here from Janelle, will we receive the presentations after? Yes, Janelle, I will post them to our YouTube channel, so I'll let you know when they're available. So how are you determining the profitability? Solely on industry average chem seed fertilizer costs, or are these grower provided costs? Are the costs like costs of equipment, operation, or land factored in? So I see Andrea had also answered that question. We use grower provided costs when available. If not, we use regional variable costs. Is there anything to add to that?
No, just to add that, thank you, Andrea. Andrea, as I mentioned, is part of our PPSN network, and I appreciate that she's answering questions at the same time. And I think that's right. So the key piece is that we work with the farmer, and they come up with a number that they think represents their average costs, particularly in the future. So it's really about predicting future costs. So, and if they want to be really conservative, they don't want to, let's say, take part of their field out that they don't need to, we would recommend that they choose, costs that are on the lower side, to be more optimistic.
Okay. We have a question from Rahul. How does identifying areas with satellite imagery help farmers to improve marginal lands in relation to ROI? Did you ever, or have you ever done studies on it, and would you be able to show the case numbers?
I think that's one of the major goals of what we're doing right now. So this is we're in year 3 now of what will end up being about a 5 or 6 year project. And by the end of that, we hope to be able to actually do those kinds of things. So it's a big thing to estimate what that return of investment would be. But looking at it on a field by field basis, we think there's really high potential for there to be more than paid for itself.
There's a lot of questions here, which is excellent. So I might not get to them all, but I'll try and get as many as I can. Um, with regards to your email, Paul, is it okay if I put that in the chat box? I might not get
Absolutely.
it done right away, but I will do that.
Absolutely. And I think, I don't know if anyone can see it, but it should be under my name, with my name in my video box as well.
Okay. From a policy standpoint, how can Canada ensure that maintaining natural habitats on marginal land becomes a sustainable practice for farmers over the long term, especially in the face of unpredictable weather and climate conditions?
Right. This is I guess the $1 million policy question, and I'm not really a policy person, but I mean, I can say that, and as I say that, we also do have economists working with us at the University of Saskatchewan and Waterloo, who are looking into these approaches. But certainly, I think that incentivizing farmers to make that initial change is a key piece. And we're hoping to show that it doesn't need to be a very costly initial incentive. And then the next piece is it's incentivized itself to keep it out of production once it's already been converted, because we already know that a lot of these areas are marginal, and re-breaking them, turning them back into crop isn't going to be worthwhile often. So I think there's a real natural intrinsic incentive to keep them natural for the long term. Although it won't always be the case, we think there's an important piece there.
Thank you. Paul says, it's good to hear the positive effects of the messy areas of the field. I'm curious, has there been considerations of the negative effects, such as plants in these areas being hosts for disease, weed seed spilling from messy places?
Yes. So we've looked at that, but I wouldn't say we've looked at that comprehensively, but it has been looked at by many other people through many lenses. So, for one, I guess you're talking about, in particular cases, we might be talking about intermediate hosts of plant diseases. You might also be talking about pests that might overwinter in messy areas. And I think that, definitely in some fields, some of the time, in some years, in some parts of the prairies, these are going to be true. Absolutely. We have good evidence of that. But the question is, on average, in the long term, is the recommendation no messy areas because there might be one bad year of grasshoppers spilling over, or because of risks of an intermediate host for a plant disease that we now have really good genetics to resist. I think that seeing the big picture here, the benefits are net benefits on the long term and across big geography. So, and one of our studies in particular looked at that across Alberta, the 2020 study, and we found that messier regions of the province tended to have higher net yields, taking into account all sorts of other factors that vary across that big a geography. So I think that tells us that, despite those risks, which we know in some fields might be a problem, on average, and we have to talk about averages when we're talking about big areas, it's not a problem. I'm long answer, sorry.
That's okay. No, I think people will appreciate the information. I'll go on to a couple more questions. Where is the best place in the field to plant a pollinator strip? If the pollinator strip is along the ditch where it would be easy to seed and out of the way of the farmer, will you still see the benefits versus the ditch itself?
Yeah, so I think what we found here, and that's a really great question, is where do you situate your marginal area in the field? And if it were true, if it were in the middle of the field, like this messy place is in this picture, well, it's going to have a positive effect on all sides, isn't it? Whereas if it's on the edge, it's only going to have an effect on one side of that messy place. So it's really, I think, if you could put it in the middle of the field, if it is going to have a positive effect, and it's going to have a small one depending on the crop, put it in the middle of the field. Now, if you want to do it for biodiversity reasons, just do it. Okay, if you want to do it for sustainability reasons, if you want to do it because you want to minimize your impact on that landscape and be a steward of that landscape, just do it. Don't worry about where it is.
Kathleen is asking if your papers that you had mentioned are on open access and are they available to read?
Yeah, some of them are open access, but we haven't done that systematically. But I would happy to make them available to anyone who asks. Please don't hesitate to send me an email, and I'll just dump them in the email, send them to you.
Okay. Jonathan is asking, given the unprofitable acres are interspersed with profitable ones, how can we accurately delineate these areas and streamline cropping operations on them?
Yeah, so I think this is an important technical problem. Let's just go back to one of those pictures I had here. Where are we? So, looking at this field, it would certainly be easier to square off areas, or maybe we could do sort of a gentle curve on this one. And these are issues that we work on one-on-one, that Andrea and Tamara, our grower cooperator liaisons, are working one-on-one with farmers, and it's always that individual solution based on what works for them. But the amount of driving, the amount of turning, they're all factors. And I think it has to be done on a case-by-case basis. But certainly, is there a general approach to this? I don't know. I think maybe the general approach is no, it's a case-by-case. We have to work with everybody one-on-one.
Okay, how about just one more question? Has the effect of cedar overlap been teased out in these studies to confirm that the halo effect at the field's edges is 100% due to the proximity of the messy areas and do not partially due to the double seeding, double fertilization occurring in some of these places?
Yeah, so I mean, we have thought about that, and so we've looked at it because we've looked at it, as I say, over 757 fields. So in some of the fields and in some of the features we looked at, it might be an issue. In others, it won't be an issue. So when we look at it across such a large number of features and a large number of fields, a large number of averages, we suspect that although it may have a small effect, it's not driving it. So, excellent question. Again, hard thing for us to robustly control because we need to get accurate data from a large number of fields and farmers, which is impossible, basically. But we think that across such a large number of fields and contexts that we've enough control for that effect. And by the way, not all of our features are circular, and not all of them are going to see that pattern, right? So, great question.
Paul, I was just looking at the time, and we actually have you until 10:45.
Okay.
According to my schedule. Can I keep asking you questions?
Well, you certainly can, but I don't want to bore people. So if they're bored, they can maybe just mute me.
I highly doubt that, given the fact that there's a lot of questions here.
Okay.
So I'll keep asking. So thank you for the good information and informative presentation. My question is, canola fields are often heavily sprayed, and I wonder if you explored any differences between the bugs' presence and number on sprayed versus non-sprayed or less sprayed fields.
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we do is we sample throughout the season. So we're going to be getting snapshots before. So we have multiple insect samples at different times of the season, usually sometimes as many as 5 or 6 times. So we're getting, before and after spraying in some cases. But I think, again, it's a big sample size. We do enough fields that we're capturing a lot of variation there. So we're probably getting some fields that have less and some that have more. And that's going to come out in the average. It would be lovely to do a study in which we have canola fields that have far less spraying versus those that have an average amount. Very difficult to convince farmers not to do that. So we haven't done that study, but I'd like to.
Thank you. Next question. This is from Clinton. Great presentation, Dr. Galpern. Logistics make or breaks a farm. There is a lot of pressure to reduce cedar sprayer overlap in the field. Many farmers as yet do not have precision equipment. In your recent work, have you given any analysis on how messy areas can be incorporated while not increasing overlap in fields?
Yeah, no, we know that's a problem, and we don't have an immediate solution to that problem. But I think there's stuff coming down the pipe. You know, I agree. Most farmers or many farmers don't have precision equipment yet, but that's likely to change increasingly. And we have, I've been to the conferences. I'm sure you have too, where we hear about, robot seeding stuff and things. I mean, that's still many years away, but potential for variable rate and so forth to having a very, very high degree of sensitivity to where you are in the field to change all those things. So at the moment, I don't think we have an answer, but I think, as with all science, we're looking ahead. We're looking forward to something that's coming down the line and trying to build practices for that time. Great question, though.
Another question. Along with pollinators, have you also considered the effects of local hydrology?
Yeah, so we're pretty confident that local hydrology is also going to have an effect on yield as well. And if there is a halo effect, it's going to be driven in part by that. I don't think we need to really do a lot of science to come down to the fact that having a little more moisture, and as long as it's not excessive, that's going to improve crop growth in an otherwise dry field. But but certainly teasing that apart is an important effect, and it's not something we have done as yet. But it's a great question.
Next question. Please explain why you think EGS exists when they don't meet the bar of materiality in the marketplace.
Okay. I'm afraid I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to answer that question head on. But I think the question is, why do we care about ecosystem goods and services or ecosystem services? Is that really ultimately the question? I don't look at ecosystem services necessarily through that economic lens alone. I look at them through the potential to improve human quality of life as well. So we understand not just that they are going to improve crops, but also that the perennial features that we have in those fields, they're going to encourage those plants to have deep root systems. That's going to help store carbon in the soil and participate and reduce and offset any additional nitrogen in the soil. That's going to have greenhouse gas limitation or mitigation effects. So think about ecosystem goods and services, if you like, or ecosystem services writ large, as not just about an economic story. I guess that's about all I'm qualified to answer, but a great question.
Next question. Has soil health been monitored in the halo area before and after a newly messy area been introduced? If yes,
Right.
Have any positive or negative effects been noted?
That's what we are doing right now as part of PPSN phase 2, as we're creating new messy areas, and we are monitoring soil health. We're monitoring insects, we're monitoring birds, we're monitoring yields, we're monitoring profits as those changes occur. So that's what we're doing, and so we'll have an answer for you soon.
And have you done any organic fields? If so, can the data be recorded and reported?
Yeah, I had one student who looked at organic fields in contrast to conventional fields, and I'm struggling now to remember the result, to be honest. But I think the fact that I don't remember it at the top of my mind suggests that it wasn't really a big difference. But if you want to follow up with an email, I'd be happy to look into that more.
Okay. Did you calculate how much money could possibly be saved by messy place in farm? Also, do you have an estimate about the value of messy place in your investigation?
Right. So our estimate is that it's losing money. It's going to be something negative. Otherwise, why do this at all? Okay. After you account for expenses and expected future productivity and crop price, we think you're going to lose money. So we know it's negative. We don't know how much negative it's going to be. And I think it depends on just how bad that part of the field is, or how big an area you choose to square off. So, But certainly with our tool, we can estimate if you like, the total loss associated with squaring off an area.
I'm going to ask just one more question before we end. Are the plan/potential to expand the tool beyond the prairie region? Are there
Not at the moment. Not at the moment. I think we're just trying to make this tool work for prairie farmers, which are a huge proportion of the Canadian agricultural industry.
Thank you. So on behalf of the Saskatchewan Institute of Agrologists, thank you so much for presenting today.